Ladies and gentlemen, let me talk to you for a minute because this right here is something a lot of people don't understand. When a man looks at you and says you're not like other women, he thinks he's giving you a compliment. But what he's really saying is, you don't fit into the box I'm used to. And that shakes him. Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you something real tonight, because this is where a lot of people get confused. When a woman knows her worth, she doesn't have to announce it. She doesn't have to argue about it. She doesn't have to defend it. Her presence does the talking. And that right there disrupts everything a weak expectation was built on. See, the world has trained women to believe that being chosen is the prize. That if a man notices you, wants you, or stays with you, then somehow that validates your value. But when a woman figures out that her value existed before any man showed up, the whole game changes. Now she's not auditioning, she's evaluating. And most men are not prepared for that shift. A man expects certain behaviors because he's seen them over and over again. He expects over-explaining. He expects emotional bargaining. He expects women to stay when they're uncomfortable just to keep the connection alive. He expects that if he pulls away, you'll chase. If he gets distant, you'll panic. If he does the bare minimum, you'll be grateful. Those are weak expectations, and they survive only because too many people keep feeding them. But then you show up. You don't rush. You don't beg for clarity. You don't force connection. You observe. You move with intention. You don't collapse emotionally just because someone hasn't decided what they want yet. And the moment a man realizes you are not operating from fear, his expectations start breaking down because now his usual tactics don't work. Silence doesn't scare you. Space doesn't threaten you. Uncertainty doesn't make you fold. That shakes him because he's used to leverage. He's used to knowing that he has the upper hand simply because he's the one being pursued. But a woman who knows her worth removes leverage from the equation. She's not controlled by attention. She's not addicted to validation. She's not desperate to be picked. She already picked herself. And when that happens, a man is forced to confront something uncomfortable. He has to ask himself, if she doesn't need me, then what do I actually bring? And a lot of men have never had to answer that question honestly. You see, when a woman values herself, she doesn't tolerate inconsistency just to keep a man around. She doesn't excuse disrespect because of potential. She doesn't shrink her standards to match someone else's effort. And that's when weak expectations collapse. Because the expectation was that you would adjust. The expectation was that you would stay quiet. The expectation was that you would be flexible at the cost of your peace. But you didn't, Tia, and now he's unsettled. Not because you're difficult, but because you're clear. Not because you're cold, but because you're centered. Not because you're asking for too much, but because you're no longer willing to accept too little. That kind of woman disrupts patterns. She breaks cycles without raising her voice. She doesn't need to argue her boundaries because she enforces them through action. She doesn't threaten to leave. She simply leaves when the situation no longer aligns with her values. And let me tell you something, ladies, nothing exposes a man faster than a woman who can walk away peacefully. Because weak expectations rely on emotional chaos. They rely on drama, confusion, guilt, and fear. But when you're calm, grounded, and self-assured, there's nothing to manipulate. There's nothing to twist. There's nothing to control. A woman who knows her worth doesn't react. She responds. She doesn't panic. She processes. She doesn't chase. She attracts. And attraction rooted in self-respect hits different. Now, here's the part people don't like to talk about. When you operate from self-worth, you will disappoint people who benefited from your self-doubt. You will confuse people who expected access without effort. You will upset people who thought you would always be available, always understanding, always accommodating. And that's okay, because growth is not comfortable for the people who relied on your silence. A man who expected you to accept less will feel challenged. He might say you've changed. He might say you're acting different. He might say you're too independent now. But what he's really saying is that the version of you he could predict is gone. And that's powerful. You see, when a woman knows her worth, she stops negotiating her standards in private and enforcing them in public. She lives them consistently. She doesn't say one thing and tolerate another. She doesn't preach self-love and accept disrespect behind closed doors. Her alignment speaks louder than her words, and that alignment forces men to either rise or remove themselves. There is no middle ground. A man can no longer sit comfortably in ambiguity. He can no longer give half effort and expect full access. He can no longer show up inconsistently and still be rewarded because your worth has raised the entry fee. And here's the truth. Some men will rise. They'll adjust, they'll grow, they'll become better because they're inspired by your standards. But others will fall away, not because you were too much, but because they were never equipped to meet you where you stand. And that's not arrogance. That's clarity. A woman who knows her worth is not loud. She's not combative. She's not demanding. She's decisive. She knows when to stay, when to speak, and when to walk away. She understands that her peace is more valuable than potential, and her dignity is worth more than attention. And when you reach that level, you don't just disrupt weak expectations, you dismantle them completely. Because the moment you stop asking to be valued, the world has no choice but to respond differently. And that's why knowing your worth is not just self-love, it's power. Ladies and gentlemen, let me explain something that a lot of people misunderstand. Because when we talk about men being shaken, people assume it's about looks, charm, or attention. But the truth is, men are not undone by beauty. Beauty is common. What truly unsettles a man is boundaries, discipline, and self-respect, especially when it comes from a woman he can't control. A man can admire beauty and keep moving. A man can desire beauty and still feel secure. But when a woman stands firm in who she is, when she knows what she will and will not accept, when she doesn't bend every time the wind changes, that's when a man starts to feel pressure. Not pressure from her, but pressure from the standard she represents. See, a lot of men are used to access without accountability. They're used to showing up when it's convenient and disappearing when it's not. They're used to testing limits and finding out there aren't any. They're used to women explaining why they deserve respect instead of requiring it. And over time, that becomes comfortable. Then here comes a woman with boundaries. She doesn't argue about her limits. She doesn't threaten consequences. She doesn't explain herself into exhaustion. She simply says no and means it. That right there is disruptive. Because boundaries remove confusion, they eliminate gray areas, they expose intention. And when a woman has boundaries, a man can no longer hide behind uncertainty or mixed signals. He either steps up or steps aside. And that's where the shaking begins. Because boundaries are not about controlling others, they're about controlling access. A woman with self-respect understands that not everyone deserves her time, energy, or emotional investment. She doesn't reward inconsistency with loyalty. She doesn't reward neglect with patience. She doesn't reward potential with commitment. And when a man realizes he can't cross lines without consequence, he feels it. Not because she's harsh, but because she's firm. Not because she's cold, but because she's clear. You see, self-respect changes how you move. It changes how you speak. It changes what you tolerate in silence. A woman with self-respect doesn't wait until she's fed up to say something. Shh. E addresses issues early, calmly, and directly. And if the behavior doesn't change, she doesn't argue. She adjusts her presence. And that adjustment is loud because men are used to second chances. They're used to forgiveness being automatic. They're used to being talked back into comfort. But when a woman's self-respect is intact, forgiveness does not equal access. Accountability comes first. That's when a man starts to feel exposed because now charm doesn't work. Excuses don't work. Grand gestures don't work if the foundation is shaky. And when a man realizes he has to consistently show up, not occasionally impress, he has to confront his own discipline. That's why boundaries shake men who aren't ready. A woman with boundaries doesn't fear being misunderstood. She fears betraying herself. She doesn't stay quiet to keep the peace. She speaks clearly to keep her dignity. She understands that discomfort is temporary, but self-disrespect leaves a lasting scar. And here's the part that really hits. A woman who respects herself doesn't wait for closure. She doesn't need explanations to move on. She doesn't require validation to walk away. If the energy is off, if the effort is inconsistent, if the respect is missing, she trusts herself enough to step back. That kind of trust is powerful because men are used to being the deciders. They're used to controlling the pace, the direction, the outcome. But a woman with boundaries is not waiting for a decision. She is making one. And when a man realizes that the woman in front of him is choosing, not hoping, his sense of control disappears. That's unsettling. Not because he doesn't care, but because he can't predict her. E's not emotional leverage. She's not reactive. She's not attached to outcomes. She's attached to her values, and values don't bend under pressure. You see, boundaries also reveal intention. A man who is serious will respect them. He will adjust. He will communicate. He will show consistency. But a man who isn't serious will push back. He will test limits. He will call her difficult, cold, or dramatic. But that resistance is information. Because when someone reacts negatively to your boundaries, they were benefiting from the absence of them. And a woman with self-respect doesn't argue with that information. She accepts it and moves accordingly. She doesn't chase understanding from someone who refuses to meet her with respect. She doesn't lower her standards to make someone else comfortable. She stands firm. And that firmness changes the dynamic completely because now the relationship is no longer about chemistry alone. It's about character. It's no longer about how much you like each other. It's about how you treat each other. And when a woman demands character through her boundaries, a man has to look at himself honestly. He has to decide whether he's capable of meeting her where she stands. Some men will rise, others will retreat, but either way, the truth is revealed because boundaries don't push the right man away. They protect the woman from the wrong one. And when a woman understands that, she stops apologizing for her standards. She stops explaining her self-respect. She stops feeling guilty for requiring consistency, effort, and honesty. She knows that what she offers is valuable and access to her is earned. And that understanding doesn't just shake sets the entire dynamic. Because a woman who respects herself teaches others how to treat her without saying a word. Ladies and gentlemen, let me break this down for you because this is one of the most powerful truths a woman can understand, and it's one of the hardest for some men to accept. A woman who doesn't compete, chase, or beg doesn't just act differently. She operates on a whole different frequency, and that frequency shakes men in ways they can't always explain. See, most men are used to being pursued. They're used to the energy of desperation, the tension of uncertainty, the power that comes from knowing that if they walk away, the woman will beg, plead, or run after them. That has been the pattern for so long that it feels natural, comfortable, and frankly, entitled. But then here comes a woman who refuses to play that game. She doesn't chase, she doesn't beg, and she doesn't compete for attention or affection. And suddenly, everything he thought he understood is turned upside down. When you stop chasing, you take the emotional power off the table. You are no longer the prize to be won through persuasion or persistence. You are no longer someone he can test and manipulate to prove his worth. And a man who has grown accustomed to that dynamic doesn't know how to respond. He can't rely on old tactics. He can't depend on the familiar patterns that have always worked. He has to confront the fact that you exist on a level where your attention isn't something he can demand. It's something he must earn every day through consistency, respect, and integrity. And let me tell you, ladies, that kind of shift is unsettling for a lot of men. It's unsettling because use a woman who refuses to compete doesn't create unnecessary drama to prove herself. She doesn't manufacture jealousy to see if he cares. She doesn't overextend herself to gain validation. She simply moves with dignity and clarity, knowing that her worth is not tied to his reactions or his approval. And when a man sees that, he's forced to evaluate himself. He has to ask, am I giving enough? Am I showing up in the way she deserves? Can I even meet her standard? And for many, that's uncomfortable because it's honest, it's real. It requires reflection, effort, and accountability, none of which are easy when you've grown used to taking the easy path. Now let's talk about the chasing part, because this is where most women get tripped up. Chasing is exhausting. It's degrading. It's based on the illusion that your value is conditional upon someone else's attention. But when you remove that from the equation, something remarkable happens. A man can no longer assume your presence, your interest, or your loyalty. He can't treat your love as disposable. And that uncertainty, while it might seem scary at first, is actually a test of his authenticity, of his intentions, and of his capacity to rise to meet a woman who refuses to chase. Because here's the truth: the moment a woman stops begging for attention, she stops enabling weakness. She stops tolerating inconsistency. She stops giving away power she hasn't been given the right to relinquish. And that creates a mirror for the man. It forces him to see himself as he really is, not as he wants to be perceived. It forces him to confront his own flaws, his own laziness, and his own lack of accountability. And let me tell you, most men have never been confronted like that before. They're used to externalizing responsibility, blaming circumstances, or relying on charm to cover gaps in character. But when a woman refuses to chase, none of that works. She's not impressed by words alone. She's not swayed by excuses or promises. She's looking for alignment between his words and his actions. And that alignment is rare, it's valuable, and it's powerful. A woman who doesn't compete also changes the way a man sees relationships. He's no longer the center of your universe, and that's terrifying for someone who's used to being the dominant force. But it's liberating for you, because it means your happiness is self-sustained, your confidence is not negotiable, your peace is protected. And he can either meet you there or he can step aside. There is no in-between. And that clarity, ladies, is what shakes men more than anything else. Not beauty, not charm, not attention. It's the presence of a woman who is whole, who is centered, and who refuses to compromise her integrity for anyone. And when a man sees that a woman doesn't beg, doesn't chase, and doesn't compete, he starts to value the relationship differently. He starts to understand that it's not about controlling her or keeping her on a leash. It's about mutual respect, effort, and authenticity. He begins to recognize that love, when it is earned rather than demanded, carries weight. He realizes that a woman who doesn't chase is a woman who commands respect simply by existing on her own terms. And that realization can be humbling. It can be intimidating, but it can also be transformative for those who are willing to rise to the occasion. See, most men are not tested like this because so many women continue to participate in cycles of chasing and competing. They continue to give their energy freely to those who haven't earned it. They continue to negotiate their standards in the hope of love. But a woman who refuses to chase is different. She doesn't negotiate. She doesn't plead. She doesn't compete for attention that isn't freely given. She waits for the right energy, the right effort, and the right alignment. And Dave, at patience is not passive, it's power. It's an unshakable foundation that men can either recognize and rise to or fail to meet entirely. And let me tell you something else, ladies. When you stop chasing, the dynamics of attraction completely change. Men begin to respect your time, your space, and your boundaries because they can feel that your presence is earned, not assumed. They begin to notice the difference between someone who values them conditionally and someone who values herself unconditionally. And that difference shakes them because it forces them to confront their own priorities. It forces them to ask themselves whether they are truly ready for a woman who refuses to settle, a woman who refuses to beg, and a woman who refuses to compete. And that's the power of refusing to chase. That's the power of refusing to compete. That's the power of refusing to beg. Because when a woman operates from that space, she doesn't just shake men, she elevates them. She challenges them. She inspires them to show up fully or step aside. And that is the kind of energy that creates respect, authenticity, and lasting connection. Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you something that too many people overlook when they talk about relationships, about attraction, about power dynamics between men and women. Authentic confidence forces a man to confront who he really is, and that is not always comfortable for him. You see, most men are used to being in control, used to operating in spaces where the woman's insecurity fills the gaps, used to being the driver while someone else adjusts, compromises, and bends to keep the connection alive. But when a woman walks into the room with true confidence, not the kind that brags or demands attention, but the kind that quietly radiates from knowing her worth, everything changes. Suddenly, a man has to step up, not because he's told to, but because he is confronted with a woman who will not settle, will not compromise, and will not manipulate to maintain him in her life. Confidence is not about loud statements or showing off. True confidence is calm, measured, and unapologetic. It's knowing that your value doesn't come from anyone else's approval. It's knowing that your happiness is self-sufficient, that your life has direction, and that your peace is non-negotiable. And when a man sees that in a woman, he is forced to take a long, hard look at himself. He realizes that he can no longer hide behind charm, excuses, or manipulation. The games that once worked, the tricks he once relied on, suddenly don't matter anymore because you are not playing. You are not performing. You are standing fully in who you are, and that exposes his intentions, his discipline, and his character, or lack thereof. Most men have never had to confront a woman like that. They are used to easy access, emotional leverage, and predictable reactions. But when a woman has authentic confidence, she changes the entire dynamic. She doesn't compete with others, she doesn't chase attention, she doesn't beg for validation, and she doesn't tolerate disrespect. And because of that, a man can no longer take her for granted. He can no longer assume that her presence is a given. He must now evaluate whether he is worthy of her time, her energy, and her emotional investment. And let me tell you, ladies, that is exactly the kind of pressure that makes some me uncomfortable because it demands accountability. Confidence forces clarity. When you know who you are, you don't accept half-hearted efforts, and you don't settle for mediocrity. You create standards and stick to them. You don't need to manipulate a man to make him notice you because your presence, your energy, and your integrity do the work for you. And when a man encounters that, he cannot help but be shaken because the rules of the game have changed. He cannot rely on coercion, games, or half measures anymore. He either rises to meet you or he falls short. There is no middle ground. And here's something most women don't fully appreciate. Authentic confidence also forces a man to confront his fears. He is suddenly faced with the truth about himself, the gaps between who he wants to be and who he actually is, the weaknesses he has ignored, and the effort he has avoided. When a woman is confident, she doesn't need constant reassurance. She doesn't demand empty promises, and she doesn't over-explain her boundaries. She simply holds her space, lives her truth, and expects the world to respect it. And that level of self-possession can be intimidating for a man who has grown accustomed to control or who has relied on manipulation to maintain relationships in the past. Confidence is magnetic because it is not conditional. It doesn't depend on a man's behavior, on social validation, or on comparison to anyone else. It comes from within. And a man who encounters that type of energy is forced to elevate himself if he wants to match it. He can't stay stagnant. He can't hide behind excuses. He can't continue to show up with half-hearted effort. He is forced to confront his own standards, his own integrity, and his own commitment, or risk losing access to someone who is operating on an entirely higher level. And here's the truth. Some men will rise, some men will resist, and some men will retreat. But that is not your problem. The power is in your alignment. The power is in your knowing that your energy is not for everyone, that your standards are not negotiable, and that your peace is more valuable than temporary attention. Authentic confidence makes a man either step up or step aside, and it leaves nothing hidden. It exposes character in a way that charm, beauty, or persistence never could. A confident woman also has patience. She doesn't panic if a man falters. She doesn't chase after someone who hasn't proven his worth. She understands timing, consistency, and alignment. She gives energy intentionally, and she does not waste herself on uncertainty. And when a man sees that, he is forced to reflect on his own ability to show up consistently. He is forced to measure himself against her standard, not against his own comfort. And that realization can shake a man to his core because it's a challenge he cannot avoid or sidestep. Let me make this clear. Authentic confidence is not about being cold or distant. It's not about arrogance or superiority. It's about certainty, clarity, and self-respect. It's about moving through life with the understanding that your presence is valuable and your attention is earned. It's about creating an environment where a man is compelled to reflect, to act with integrity, and to bring his best self forward or leave. And that is why authentic confidence shakes men. It forces them to confront who they are, what they want, and whether they are capable of rising to a higher standard. And ladies, this is exactly why a confident woman is so powerful. Because she doesn't need to fight for respect, she doesn't need to argue for loyalty, and she doesn't need to manipulate love. Her confidence sets the bar, defines the boundaries, and reveals the truth. And in doing so, she forces a man to either meet her standard or walk away, and that right there separates those who are worthy from those who are not.